The church was filled with quiet whispers and the soft sound of people crying. Family and friends sat in rows, dressed in black, their faces filled with sorrow. The air smelled of flowers, white lilies and roses placed near the wooden coffin at the front of the room. A large photo of Margaret, the grandmother everyone loved, stood beside it. She had been kind, full of life, and always ready with a warm hug. But now, she was gone. 16-year-old Emily sat in the front row, gripping the funeral program tightly in her hands. Her heart pounded, but it wasn't just because she was sad. She felt uneasy, like something wasn't right. For the past few days, she couldn't shake off a terrible feeling. Something about her grandmother's death didn't add up. Her father, James, sat beside her, his eyes red from crying. Her uncles, Daniel and Michael, were on the other side, sitting stiffly with serious expressions. They were heartbroken, just like everyone else. But Emily kept looking at them, searching their faces for something. She didn't know what. The minister stood up and cleared his throat. Today we gather here to say goodbye to a wonderful woman, a mother, a grandmother, and a friend to many. His voice was deep and soothing, but Emily wasn't listening. Her mind was racing. She thought about the last time she saw her grandmother, just a few days before she passed away. Margaret had been sitting in her favorite chair, looking worried. Emily had asked her if something was wrong, but Margaret only smiled and said, "Some things are best left alone, dear." Now, sitting in the church, Emily wondered what she had meant. What things? What had been troubling her grandmother? The minister continued speaking. Margaret was a woman who cared deeply for her family. She was always there with wise words and a kind heart. We will miss her, but we will also celebrate the life she lived. Emily looked around the room. Most people were looking down, lost in their grief. But a few had strange expressions, almost like they were nervous. Or was she just imagining it? She wasn't sure. Her uncle Daniel stood up to give the eulogy. He walked to the front, his hands shaking slightly. "My mother was a strong woman," he began. "She worked hard to raise us, and she always put family first." But before he could continue, Emily shot up from her seat. Her heart pounded in her chest. She didn't plan to speak, but she couldn't stay silent anymore. "Stop," she said, her voice louder than she expected. Everyone turned to stare at her. The room, once filled with quiet sobs, was now completely silent. Daniel frowned. "Emily, sit down," he said in a low voice. But she shook her head. "No, we can't go on with this funeral. Something is wrong. Grandma's death, it wasn't natural." Gasps filled the room. Murmurs broke out among the guests. James grabbed her arm gently. "Emily, what are you talking about?" he asked, his face filled with concern. Emily's throat felt dry, but she forced herself to speak. "I heard Grandma talking to someone before she died. She was scared. She said, 'I know what you did.'" More gasps. Some people looked shocked. Others looked worried. The minister looked unsure of what to do. "Perhaps we should." But before he could finish, Emily's father stood up, his face pale. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed 911. The room froze. And just like that, a funeral turned into something else entirely. The room was silent, but Emily could feel the weight of every stare on her. Some people looked confused, others looked angry. Her uncle Daniel's face had turned red, and her other uncle, Michael, had a deep frown. "Emily, sit down," Daniel snapped, his voice shaking with frustration. But Emily stood her ground. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. "No," she said firmly. "I heard Grandma say those words." She was scared. Something bad happened to her. Her father, James, still holding his phone, hesitated for a moment before pressing it to his ear. "Yes, I need to report something," he said in a low, tense voice. "We're at St. Mary's Church. My daughter says my mother's death might not have been natural." The gasps in the room grew louder. People whispered among themselves. The minister looked helplessly at the crowd, unsure of what to do. "James, what are you doing?" Michael asked, his face twisted in shock. James ignored him, his voice steady as he spoke to the emergency operator. "Yes, she mentioned something suspicious before she passed." He paused, listening. "All right, we'll wait here." He lowered the phone and took a deep breath before turning to Emily. "The police are on their way." A new wave of murmurs spread through the room. Some guests looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. Others leaned forward, curious about what would happen next. "This is ridiculous," Daniel snapped. "Emily is just a kid. She's emotional. She doesn't know what she's talking about." Emily clenched her fists. "I do know what I'm talking about," she said, her voice strong. "Grandma was scared. And you know it, Uncle Daniel." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "What are you implying?" Before Emily could answer, the heavy church doors swung open. Two police officers in dark uniforms stepped inside, their eyes scanning the room. The whispering stopped immediately. The lead officer, a tall man with short brown hair, walked toward James. "Sir, we received your call. What's the situation?" James hesitated for a second before nodding toward Emily. "My daughter says she overheard my mother talking about something suspicious before she died. She believes my mother might not have passed away naturally." The officer turned to Emily. His expression was serious, but his voice was gentle. "What did you hear?" Emily swallowed hard. This was it. She had to make them believe her. "2 days before she died, I heard Grandma talking to someone on the phone," Emily said. "She sounded really scared. She said, 'I know what you did, and I won't stay quiet forever.'" The officer's expression darkened. "And you're sure about this?" Emily nodded. "Yes, I didn't think much of it at the time, but after she died so suddenly, it didn't feel right." The second officer, a woman with short blonde hair, stepped forward. "Was your grandmother sick?" she asked. James spoke up. "She had some health issues, but nothing life-threatening. Her death was unexpected." The officers exchanged glances. Then the lead officer asked, "Was there an autopsy?" Daniel suddenly stood up. "No, because we didn't need one," he said, his voice rising. "She was old, and she passed peacefully in her sleep. Why are we questioning this?" The officer looked at him carefully. "Sir, we're just doing our job. If there's even the smallest chance of foul play, we need to investigate." Emily didn't miss the way Daniel clenched his jaw. Her stomach twisted. Why was he so defensive? The officer turned to the family. "We need to halt the burial and request a medical examination." More guests. Some guests even stood up, whispering in shock. The funeral had completely changed. Emily's father sighed, rubbing his forehead. "I just want the truth." The officer nodded. "Then we'll find it." Emily took a deep breath. She had stopped the funeral, and now there was no turning back. A heavy silence filled the church. People shifted in their seats, whispering to one another. The police officers stood firm, their serious expressions making it clear that this was no longer just a funeral. It was an investigation. Emily's heart pounded as she glanced at her father. James looked pale, his eyes filled with worry. Her uncle Daniel, however, looked furious. His face was red, and his hands were clenched into fists. "This is insane," Daniel shouted, stepping forward. "We are grieving, and now you're letting a child ruin the funeral with wild accusations." Emily swallowed hard but didn't back down. "I'm not making this up," she said firmly. "Grandma was scared, and now she's gone. We have to find out why." Michael, the younger of the two uncles, spoke up, his voice quieter but tense. "I don't know, Daniel. Maybe we should listen to what the officers have to say. If there's even a small chance that something happened to Mom, don't we owe it to her to find out?" Daniel spun around to face him. "Are you serious? Mom was old. She had health problems. Of course, she passed away naturally." Michael looked unsure, glancing at James. "Still, don't you think it's strange that she was so scared before she died?" Daniel let out a frustrated sigh. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "We shouldn't even be talking about this." The lead officer, Officer Miller, held up a hand. "Sir, we understand this is a difficult time, but we have to be thorough. If there was any foul play, the truth will come out." Daniel crossed his arms and muttered under his breath. Emily watched him carefully. Why was he so angry? Why did he want to stop the investigation so badly? The second officer, Officer Reed, turned to the funeral director, who had been standing awkwardly at the side of the room. "We need to make arrangements to delay the burial until an examination can be done." The funeral director nodded quickly, his face pale. "Of course, officer, whatever is necessary." Emily glanced around the room, noticing how different people were reacting. Some guests looked shocked, some looked scared, and others looked uncomfortable, as if they wanted to leave. A woman in the back, Grandma's close friend Mrs. Carter, stood up slowly. She was an old woman with silver hair and kind eyes. "I don't mean to intrude," she said softly, "but I have to agree with Emily." Everyone turned to look at her. "I spoke to Margaret just a few days before she passed," Mrs. Carter continued. "She told me she had a bad feeling about something. She said she was worried about her medicine." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Her medicine?" she repeated. Mrs. Carter nodded. "She told me she thought something was wrong with it. She wasn't sure if she was imagining things, but she said she sometimes felt worse after taking it instead of better." James looked at the officers. "Then we have to check. If something was wrong with her medication, that could mean." Officer Miller nodded. "We'll have a toxicology test done immediately." Daniel groaned loudly and threw his hands in the air. "So now we're just listening to gossip. This is a waste of time." Emily's stomach twisted. Why was Daniel so against this investigation? Officer Reed gave Daniel a sharp look. "Sir, if you have nothing to hide, then this shouldn't be a problem." Daniel's face stiffened, but he didn't say another word. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. Something was definitely wrong. And now she was more determined than ever to find out the truth. The tension in the church was thick. Nobody knew what to say. Some guests still whispered, while others sat frozen in shock. The funeral was supposed to be a time of mourning, but now everything had changed. Emily stood tall, even though her heart was racing. She had spoken up, and now there was no turning back. Her father, James, was still gripping his phone, his face filled with worry. Uncle Daniel paced near the front of the church, shaking his head angrily. Uncle Michael stood silently, looking lost in thought. Officer Miller cleared his throat. "We're going to need to ask a few more questions." His voice was calm but firm. "Who was responsible for giving Margaret her medication?" Everyone turned to look at each other. Emily's stomach twisted in knots as she waited for someone to speak. Finally, Michael hesitated before answering. "Mom took her own medicine most of the time," he said slowly. "But sometimes Daniel gave it to her." Emily's breath caught. She looked at Daniel, who now stood completely still. His face was unreadable. "That's a lie," Daniel snapped. "She was fine. Nothing was wrong with her medicine." Officer Reed pulled out a small notebook and began writing. "Sir, we're not saying anything was wrong yet, but we need to check. If she was taking medication, it will be important for the toxicology report." Daniel clenched his jaw. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. Emily's father, James, finally spoke. "Daniel, why are you so upset? If Mom's death was natural, the tests will prove it. But if something happened, don't you want to know?" Daniel's face turned red. "Because this is a waste of time." He threw his hands in the air. "Mom was old. She was sick. People die. And now, thanks to her," he pointed at Emily, "we're turning this into a circus." Emily flinched but held her ground. "I just want to know the truth," she said quietly. Officer Miller ignored Daniel's anger and looked at Emily. "Do you remember anything else from the conversation you overheard?" Emily thought hard, trying to remember every little detail. Grandma's voice was shaky. She said, "I know what you did." And then she said, "You can't fool me." A deep silence followed. It was clear now. Margaret had suspected something before she died. Michael ran a hand through his hair, looking troubled. "I should have listened to her. She told me she was scared, but I thought she was just confused." The second officer, Reed, nodded. "We'll be taking a closer look at everything, including medical records, and we'll need to speak to Margaret's doctor." Daniel groaned loudly. "So now you think she was murdered?" "We're not making any conclusions yet," Officer Miller replied. "But if something was wrong, we need to find out." Suddenly, Mrs. Carter, Grandma's old friend, spoke up again. Her voice was soft but firm. "Margaret told me something else," she said. "She said she didn't trust someone in the family." A few people gasped. Emily's heart pounded even harder. "Who?" James asked. Mrs. Carter hesitated. Her old, wrinkled hands shook as she whispered. She didn't say the name, but she was afraid, very afraid. The whole room felt colder. Emily could see the nervous glances, the uneasiness in everyone's faces. Then, Officer Reed turned to the funeral director. "We need to halt the burial process until further notice." The funeral director nodded quickly. "Of course, officer." Daniel's fists tightened. "This is a mistake," he muttered under his breath. Emily didn't say anything, but deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. Something was wrong, and soon, the truth would come out. The church was no longer a place of mourning. It had turned into a crime scene. The once soft whispers had turned into frantic murmurs. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some even grabbed their coats, ready to leave. But no one dared to move. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Everything was happening so fast. The police were now involved, and the burial was stopped. Grandma's death was no longer just a sad event. It was a mystery. Officer Miller turned to the family. "We need to take statements. Mr. James, let's start with you." Emily's father nodded and stepped forward. "My mother wasn't in perfect health, but she wasn't dying either," he explained. "She had some heart problems, but her doctor said she was doing fine." Officer Reed jotted notes down. "Who saw Margaret last before she passed?" A long silence followed. Then Michael, the younger uncle, hesitated before speaking. "Daniel was with her the night before she passed." All eyes turned to Daniel. His face twisted in frustration. "Yes, I was there. I checked on her, made her tea, and gave her medicine. I do that all the time. That doesn't mean I did anything wrong." Emily felt a lump in her throat. "What medicine did you give her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel narrowed his eyes at her. "The same pills she always took," he snapped. "She needed them." Officer Miller stepped closer. "And where are these pills now?" Daniel clenched his jaw. "Probably still in her room." "We'll need to take a look," Officer Reed said firmly. At that moment, the church doors opened again, and a woman rushed in. She looked flustered, her curly brown hair messy as if she had been running. It was Grandma's nurse, Linda. "I just heard," she said, out of breath. "Is it true? The funeral is stopped." James nodded. "The police are investigating Mom's death." Linda's face paled. "Oh my God," she whispered. "I knew something was wrong." Everyone froze. Officer Miller stepped toward her. "What do you mean?" Linda bit her lip, as if unsure whether she should say anything. Then she sighed. "Margaret told me something strange a few days before she died. She said she felt different, like something was making her weak." Emily's pulse raced. "Did she say why?" Linda nodded. "She thought it had something to do with her medicine." Daniel groaned loudly. "Enough with this nonsense. She was old. Old people get weak. Why is everyone making this into a big deal?" Linda frowned. "She trusted me, Daniel. She told me she had a bad feeling." Officer Reed exchanged a glance with Officer Miller before turning back to Linda. "Did she mention anyone specifically?" Linda hesitated. "No, but she asked me if I ever noticed anything strange with her medicine bottles. At the time, I didn't think much of it. But now. Michael ran a shaky hand through his hair. "Oh God," he muttered. "What if?" He didn't finish his sentence, but everyone understood what he was thinking. Emily clenched her fists. She had been right. Something was very, very wrong. Officer Miller turned to Daniel. "Sir, we will need to see Margaret's medication and check the house." Daniel's face darkened. "You can't be serious." "We are," Officer Reed said sternly. James took a deep breath. "If something happened to Mom, we need to know." Emily's stomach twisted. The truth was coming. And she had a feeling it was going to change everything. The air in the church was thick with tension. Emily could hear the whispers growing louder as people processed what was happening. The funeral had turned into something no one expected. Instead of saying goodbye to Grandma, they were now searching for answers about her death. Officer Miller turned to Linda, the nurse. "You said Margaret was worried about her medicine. Did she tell you if she noticed anything unusual?" Linda hesitated. She said sometimes the pills looked different, but she wasn't sure if it was her imagination. Emily's father, James, looked deep in thought. Mom was always careful with her medicine. If she noticed something strange, it wasn't just in her head. Daniel let out a loud, frustrated sigh. "This is ridiculous. You're all acting like Mom was murdered. She was old, and she died. That's it." Officer Reed gave him a sharp look. "Sir, we are not making any assumptions. But if there's a possibility that something was wrong, we need to investigate." Daniel's face was red with anger. "Investigate what?" "Medicine. You can check it, but I'm telling you, there's nothing wrong." Officer Miller turned to James. "Would you be able to take us to Margaret's house?" James nodded. "Yes. I have the keys." The officers then turned to the guests. "We understand this is a difficult situation, but for now, we need to pause the funeral proceedings." The guests exchanged nervous glances, some murmuring about how shocking this was. Emily felt her heart pounding. She had never expected this to happen. As everyone slowly filed out of the church, Emily walked beside her father, gripping his arm. "Dad, what if we really find something?" she whispered. James sighed. "Then we'll deal with it, Emily, no matter what." Arriving at Grandma's house. 15 minutes later, Emily, her father, Daniel, Michael, the police officers, and Linda arrived at Grandma's house. It felt strange walking into the house now, knowing Grandma would never be here again. Officer Reed spoke first. "Where did Margaret keep her medicine?" "In the kitchen," James answered, leading them inside. They walked past the cozy living room, where Grandma used to sit and knit, into the small kitchen. Everything looked the same. The wooden cabinets, the round dining table, the little flower vase by the window. Linda walked to a cupboard near the sink and opened it. She reached in and pulled out a small container filled with prescription bottles. "These are the ones she took daily," she said. Officer Miller took the bottles and examined them carefully. "We'll need to take these for testing." As he placed the bottles in a plastic evidence bag, Emily suddenly noticed something odd. On the counter near the sink, there was another small pill bottle, half hidden behind a teapot. "What's that?" she asked, pointing at it. Linda frowned and picked it up. She turned the bottle around and gasped. This isn't her usual medicine." Officer Reed took it from her and examined the label. "This prescription isn't in Margaret's name," she said. "It belongs to Daniel Morris." Everyone turned to Daniel. His face went pale. "What?" he said, his voice shaking. That's mine. I must have left it here by accident." Michael narrowed his eyes. "Why would your medicine be mixed with Mom's?" Daniel took a step back. "I don't know. Maybe she put it there by mistake." Officer Miller looked at Linda. "Do you know what this medication is?" Linda hesitated before answering. "It's a strong sedative. If taken in high doses, it can cause confusion, weakness, and even heart problems." A heavy silence filled the room. Emily's heart pounded. Grandma was feeling weak, she whispered. She was confused. James turned to Daniel, his voice low and dangerous. "What did you do?" Daniel's eyes darted around the room. I didn't do anything. I swear." Officer Reed's expression was serious. "We'll need to take you in for questioning, Mr. Morris." Daniel took another step back. "You can't be serious." Officer Miller moved closer. "Sir, this evidence suggests that Margaret may have been given something that affected her health. We need to know the truth." Daniel's breathing was fast. His hands shook. Emily could feel the fear in the room. Something was very, very wrong. And now, the truth was finally coming to light. The air in Grandma's kitchen felt thick and heavy. Emily stood frozen, her heart pounding. Everyone's eyes were on Daniel. His face was pale, his hands trembling. The bottle of sedatives sat in the officer's gloved hands, proof that something wasn't right. Officer Miller stepped forward. "Mr. Morris, we need you to come with us for questioning." Daniel let out a short, nervous laugh. "You're treating me like a criminal. This is crazy. I didn't do anything to Mom." James, Emily's father, took a deep breath. His voice was tight with anger. "Then explain why your medicine was with hers." Daniel shook his head quickly. I must have left it here by accident." He looked at Michael, his younger brother, as if searching for help. "You believe me, right?" Michael's face was unreadable. He stared at Daniel for a long moment before speaking. "I don't know what to believe anymore." A silence fell over the room. Then Mrs. Carter, Grandma's old friend, stepped forward. Her voice was soft but firm. "Margaret was scared, Daniel. She knew something was wrong. And now we do too." Daniel's face twisted in frustration. He looked around wildly, as if hoping someone would defend him. But no one spoke. Officer Reed sighed. "Mr. Morris, resisting won't help you. We need answers. If this was a mistake, now is the time to explain." Daniel's breathing was quick and shallow. His hands curled into fists. But then, slowly, he let them fall to his sides. His shoulders slumped. He looked exhausted, like he had been carrying a heavy secret for too long. Finally, he spoke. "I never meant for this to happen," he whispered. Emily's stomach clenched. James' voice was sharp. "What do you mean?" Daniel took a deep breath. "Mom, she was always nagging me. She kept saying I wasn't responsible enough, that I couldn't take care of myself. She said I wasted my money and didn't deserve my inheritance." His voice cracked. "She was going to change her will." Michael's eyes widened. "Are you saying?" Daniel cut him off. "I didn't want to hurt her. I just wanted her to be weak enough to depend on me, so she wouldn't take me out of the will." His voice shook. "I started giving her small doses of my medicine, just enough to make her tired, confused. I thought she would trust me more, rely on me." He squeezed his eyes shut. "I didn't know it would kill her." A heavy silence filled the room. Emily's hands were shaking. "Grandma knew," she whispered. "That's why she said, 'I know what you did.'" Officer Reed exchanged a glance with Officer Miller before stepping forward. "Daniel Morris, you are under arrest for endangering Margaret Morris' life and possible involuntary manslaughter." Daniel's face crumpled. No, I didn't mean to." The officers moved quickly, placing handcuffs on his wrists. James' hands were clenched into fists, his face full of pain and anger. "She was our mother, Daniel." Tears streamed down Michael's face. "You could have just talked to her, but instead, you did this." Daniel didn't answer. He looked broken, defeated. As the officers led him toward the door, he muttered one last thing. "I'm sorry." Emily felt tears sting her eyes. Sorry wasn't enough. As Daniel was taken away, the room remained silent. The truth had finally come out. Grandma hadn't died naturally. She had been betrayed by her own son. Emily looked at her father. "What happens now?" she whispered. James took a deep breath. "Now we let justice take its course." Emily nodded. She knew one thing for sure. Grandma's voice had been heard. And thanks to her, The truth had not been buried with her. The house felt empty after the police left with Daniel. No one spoke for a long time. Emily sat at the kitchen table, her hands still shaking. She had come to Grandma's funeral expecting to say goodbye. Instead, she had uncovered a terrible secret. Her father, James, rubbed his face with his hands. "I can't believe this," he muttered. "Daniel, my own brother. How could he do this to Mom?" Michael sat across from him, his face pale. "I keep thinking, what if we had noticed sooner? What if we had listened to her when she said she felt weak?" He looked at Emily with sadness in his eyes. "You were the only one who paid attention." Emily swallowed hard. "I didn't want to believe it either," she admitted. "But when I heard Grandma's voice that night, I knew something was wrong." Linda, the nurse, sighed. Margaret was a strong woman. Even in her last moments, she tried to fight. She wiped a tear from her eye. "I just wish she didn't have to go through this." James took a deep breath and stood up. "We can't change what happened, but we can make sure Mom gets the respect she deserves." He looked at Emily. "We should finish the funeral. Say goodbye properly." Emily nodded. "Yes, she deserves that." The funeral continues. An hour later, the family returned to the church. Many guests had stayed, waiting quietly to pay their respects. The police had explained the situation to them, and though they were shocked, they understood. As Emily walked back inside, she saw Mrs. Carter sitting in the front row. The old woman gave her a small, sad smile. "You were very brave, my dear." Emily sat beside her. "I just wanted the truth." Mrs. Carter patted her hand. "And because of you," Margaret's voice was heard. The service continued, though it was different now. The weight of what had happened still hung in the air, but there was also a sense of peace. James stood at the podium and cleared his throat. "My mother was a kind, strong woman. She loved her family deeply. Even in her last moments, she tried to protect us." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "We almost lost the truth today. But thanks to my daughter, we know what really happened. And now we can honor my mother properly." Emily felt her throat tighten. Tears welled in her eyes as she listened to her father's words. When it was her turn to speak, she stepped forward. The whole church was silent, waiting for her. "I loved my grandma," she began softly. "She was always there for me. She told the best stories. She made the best cookies. And she always knew when something was wrong." She took a deep breath. She was strong. And even though she's gone, she still helped us find the truth. She looked at the casket and whispered, "I love you, Grandma. And I promise, we won't forget you." As she stepped down, she felt lighter, as if Grandma was watching over her, smiling, finding closure. After the funeral, the family gathered outside. The sky was cloudy, but the air felt calm. Michael turned to James. "What happens now?" James sighed. "Daniel will have to face the law, but we'll get through this, together." Emily looked up at her father. "Do you think Grandma forgives him?" James thought for a moment, then nodded. "She always believed in family, but forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. We have to learn from this." Emily nodded. She didn't know if she could ever forgive Daniel, but she did know one thing. Her grandmother's story wouldn't be forgotten. As they walked to the car, Emily felt the wind brush against her cheek, soft and gentle. Maybe, just maybe, it was Grandma's way of saying goodbye.